We're back in the hot seats, my friends, here again on Polly Pat's Paradigm. Joined here in the new year, 2021, by my good friend Eric Robinson. And we just had a lot of fun talking about the consecration to St. Joseph we just did. And we're back for another impromptu hot seat Q&A episode, whatever we call these things, where we just throw questions and challenges each other's way and see whether we're competent or not. And
wow, no pressure.
Yeah, see whether these episodes get aired or not, right?
Yes.
But yeah, always a pleasure. I always enjoy these. They're fun. We never tell each other what we're bringing to the table.
Yeah.
So it's good. It's something I look forward to, and we try to do these usually once a month, once every 2 months. So
yes,
always a joy. Eric, how are you?
Good. Yeah, I try to tie in at least one question that kind of has to do with philosophy. So maybe I'll do that this time. Maybe not. We don't know. I mean, I know what I'm going to ask, but you don't know.
I've got a pretty narrow wheelhouse, so that's all right. I'll punt if I have to.
You don't have a narrow wheelhouse. You're a generalist. You're an expert in everything, right?
I've got a narrow generalism, I guess you could say. Let's see. If you ask me about music or philosophy, I'll probably be all right. If you, we'll see. Yeah, we'll see. Yeah. I always qualified that I am a studious amateur at best when it comes to theology. So
wow.
Yeah. So I defer the tougher theological questions to you. That's why you're my co-host, right?
I also feel like you're good with politics. But
yeah, well, political philosophy was really kind of one of the first things I was really interested in, just as a teenager. I guess if people don't mind us chatting for a minute. So I kind of grew up with a lot of liberal leanings, and then I read a couple of books that got me interested in libertarianism specifically, because I was like, oh, actually, this kind of sounds more like the way I think about things. And then I just kind of went deep into that, into some of the more prominent libertarian thinkers in high school. And then, interestingly, with political philosophy, you kind of hit some boundaries, right? Where it's like, how do I justify this? Specifically like ethical and moral constraints. And then what you realize is that political philosophy just can't answer. It just can't answer everything, and you have to expand, and then you have to get into ethics and morality, and then ethics and morality can't. That itself is kind of derived from, I would argue, a greater metaphysical project, and then you got to go to metaphysics, and then that ultimately consumed me, and is where I spent most of the time. But it's funny, is because as I kind of went deeper and I considered ethics more, and then metaphysics, I kind of went back through, I think, with better starting points, and corrected and adjusted a lot of my political philosophy.
Wow.
So what got, in many ways, what got me interested in philosophy, my initial commitments were later changed as I got deeper into philosophy. So I would like in the next couple of years to go further again into political philosophy.
Yeah.
But in the past 5-10 years, it's just been something I've been taking frequent peeks into,
okay,
but not serious sustained study like I have with metaphysics or ethics or anything like that. Mm-hmm.
So this is not one of my hot seat questions, but now I'm curious, do you still have libertarian leanings?
If you want to give me an easy one, we could make that one of the hot seat questions. Yeah. So, what is
okay, this will be a hot seat question for
okay.
you. What is your political leaning? What is your political philosophy?
Yeah.
What is your politics?
I mean, I can't get this wrong, right? Because it's not even challenging. Or maybe we could tie it into what made me abandon libertarianism, or what are my critiques of libertarianism, maybe something like that. So I consider myself a common good conservative at this point, which is really, I think, the political perspective that comes out of a commitment to a sort of traditional natural law perspective, a contemplation of human nature, what a human being is essentially as a rational social political animal, what causes us to flourish in an objective sense, and that there is a sort of an objective flourishing that can be attained for the human person. So it's not just whatever you want, right? There are constraints on what we can do morally and ethically by our nature, by the type of thing that we are, natures that are ultimately given to us just by God. So yeah, libertarianism, broadly considered, is actually just like a kind of very far form of liberalism. And the idea of the liberal project in general is this commitment to trying to organize a pluralistic society, a society with a lot of different beliefs, maybe even cultures, with some type of dispassionate organizing principle. And the idea is, if we can find this dispassionate organizing principle, that can kind of be the glue that binds all these different beliefs and values and whatever into a cohesive society that somehow gets along and manages itself. And this is obviously a big secular project as well. And libertarianism, now I think that that's all fantasy, by the way, at this point. Like, I think that that's impossible, right? Because how could you ever be dispassionate between party A that thinks abortion is murder and party B that thinks abortion is healthcare? Like, how could you ever be dispassionate about something like that, right? Like, you just can't be, right? And politics at the end of the day is just picking winners and losers and deciding what value systems are going to prevail and which are not. So I think the whole project from a get-go sounds nice, but as you think about it more substantially, it just doesn't make any sense and at all. Now, libertarianism tries to find that dispassionate principle in something like what's called the non-aggression principle, right? That's kind of what they're trying to do, is saying whatever else should organize a society should be a principle around the idea of not initiating force or aggression against other parties, right? And, I was kind of attracted to that because I think in a general way, some libertarian thinkers like Rothbard would say it's the non-aggression axiom. Now, I think that that's false. There's nothing axiomatic about you shouldn't aggress against somebody. That's not like the law of non-contradiction, right? It's not self-evidently true. Denying it doesn't entail an absurdity. It's eminently challengeable. Many people think that there are situations where aggression is perfectly warranted. For example, if person A is abusing their children, we think that maybe a legitimate means of intervention might be political authority to remove the children, to aggress against the parent, maybe even put that parent in jail. And so there's just a lot of instances where we think actually aggression might be merited. So what I've realized, is this non-aggression principle or commitment by itself is not going to work. And in order to make it work, we would have to qualify it so heavily that it almost becomes pointless, right? Like, okay, we shouldn't aggress unless this, or unless that, or unless this other thing, right? And it's like, well, in what sense is this even worth holding on to, right? Maybe we need something a little bit more robust. So that was something I realized, is that, this sort of non-aggression, it's definitely not an axiom. Smarter libertarian thinkers who realize that would call it maybe it's a presumption. And I can go along with that to a certain extent. I'm at a point where I think aggression certainly is in various forms. And it also depends how you define aggression, because somebody might say, well, it's not aggression if somebody else is being aggressive. And then it's like, so, there's a lot of nuances here or there. But at the end of the day, libertarianism, I think, tries to hold on to a radical individualism. It tries to park morality in a sort of either a consent-based ethics, right? And I think that that's a failure, because whatever other use consent is to the moral project, it's something that floats atop deeper moral considerations, right? So I'll give you an example. Like, Eric, I can't consent for you to drive my neighbor's car because I don't have the power to give you that permission, right? You'd be like, I'd be like, so you'd be like, you can't consent to that. And well, why couldn't I? Because there's deeper moral considerations, right? It's not my property. I don't have a power to just use my neighbor's car without trespassing or thievery, which he could have a serious grievance with me. So like, consent isn't just this magic wand that you can just wave and be like, whoosh, I consent, therefore it's moral. No, consent is clearly contingent upon deeper moral considerations. And, where this is ignored is when it comes to whether we can consent to doing evil actions ourselves, right? So this is kind of what I'm getting at, right? Like, if two people, like, could I consent to cut off my own arm just willy-nilly? I would argue no, right? And that would, or if you did it, it certainly wouldn't be a moral action. It would be an evil action, unless there was some like overriding reason, like it was gangrenous and it was going to kill you if you didn't cut it off, right? But otherwise, you can't. You never have. My position now in ethics is you never have a right to do a wrong, and consent can never override that. So to the extent that any liberal project, including libertarianism, wants to kind of just reduce morality to consent, I think that's fundamentally flawed. I think that's completely wrong.
Yeah.
And a lot of libertarianism would entail that commitment, and to that extent, that's one of the reasons I reject libertarianism. So there's deeper moral reasons. I don't think the non-aggression axiom is an axiom. I don't think it's a effective organizing principle. I think it's eminently challengeable. I think their consent-based ethics is just flat out wrong. And I think just in a practical sense, a lot of it is very, especially on like the farther forms of libertarianism, like anarcho-capitalism or, the anarcho-syndicalists and people like that. It's just, it's just never going to happen, right? Like it's just so utopian thinking and like a really bad idea. So now people might say, well, all utopian thinking is bad. I would say no, it's not. Like some ideas are like utopian sounding, but they're still worth striving towards. Like I want to live in a society where we don't murder anybody. And that's kind of utopian because I don't know if we'll ever get there, but it's still worth striving towards. Other like utopian-based ideas are just so radically unrealistic and against human nature that they're not worth striving towards because it would just make everybody worse off. And I think certain forms of libertarianism, as they tend towards the anarchist side, are like that. And a part of that is because we are social political animals. So any, trying to veer towards anarchy is inherently against our nature. It's never going to be a thing. And if it ever were a thing, it would never be good for us anyways. So there's just kind of a smattering of reasons of why I eventually abandoned libertarianism. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it seems like the whole consent thing has the presupposition that morality is subjective. Mm-hmm. Oh, if enough people agree that abortion's okay, then it is okay.
Right.
But returning to an objective ethics, an objective morality, it's like, no matter how many people agree to this thing being a right or to this thing being okay, it does not make it okay.
Right. And not only that,
but
abortion is really tough for libertarians because a lot of libertarians have pro-life leanings. So it's, and I always, even before I was religious, always had strong pro-life leanings. So this was an issue for me. Because certain libertarians want to kind of just park everything in property rights as well when it comes to legality, at least. So some in terms of morality, which I think is even dumber. But for legality, hey, if it's your property, you can do whatever you want with it. So you have libertarians that kind of take on this idiotic idea that the fetus is some type of trespasser or parasite, which is, of course, biologically insane and morally ridiculous. The fetus is not a parasite. It's not a different species, right? It's your baby, and it's exactly where it's supposed to be, right? That's where babies are grown. Plus, a deeper consideration is, again, remember that any rights we have to property are always instrumental. The only reason property has any value at all is because of what it attaches to, which is that thing of intrinsic value, which is a human being. So any type of system that wants to try and use something of instrumental value to undermine that which is of intrinsic value, which is human life, is always backwards, is always going to subvert itself. And libertarianism falls prey to that, especially when it comes to life issues.
Yes. Well, that's great. I actually, some of the questions I do have for you today also have to do with politics, but I'll let you ask me a question.
Yes, sir. So I told you I found I don't see this often, but every once in a while. First, let me say, I have a lot of very great, very smart, very articulate, very nuanced, very sophisticated Protestant friends, and you know who you are, and you know I love you. But every once in a while, I come across a very special type of fundamentalist Protestant who's got all the cliche anti-Catholic tropes. And I stumbled across one on my Facebook feed the other day. And when I did, I'm like, This is for Eric. This is totally for Eric. So I screenshotted it. I won't do the name. We'll keep it anonymous, but I'll read the post. And it's not so much a question, Eric, is it's if you were to respond to this, what would you say? Type of thing.
Okay.
How does that sound? Okay. So the original post was this. There was a main post, and he had a comment underneath, and I'll read both. The first one is, the Catholic Church has done more damage to the gospel of Jesus Christ than any other denomination or Pharisee or Sadducee. That's the first one. And then he says, for example, this includes changing the Sabbath, creating new holidays, putting men in the position of God, creating idols to worship, exalting Mary above Christ, and so much more. Is he right about this, Eric? Do we need to abandon and condemn the Catholic Church?
No, we don't, because he is wrong on every account.
Every single point.
We wouldn't even know what the gospel is apart from the Catholic Church. St. Augustine even said, apart from the Catholic Church, I would not even believe the Gospels, because the Gospels, the writings that we have, are contingent upon the authority of the Catholic Church, confirming those as apostolic, as actual legitimate writings. And so has the Catholic Church distorted the gospel? Well, think about this. In Galatians, it talks about, St. Paul says, even if an angel were to come to you with a different message than I have given to you, Galatians, of the gospel, then don't listen to that angel. Let him be anathema. Let him be accursed. If someone comes to you preaching a different gospel than the one that I gave you, let him be accursed. The question then is, well, what is the gospel Paul was giving to the Galatians, and how has that gospel been passed on from generation to generation? Is through the apostles' successors, the bishops, and their successors, and their successors, and their successors. And then when we come across heretics, like the heretic Arius, well, he was starting to preach a different gospel. Well, let him be anathema then. And there was a council that determined, the Council of Nicaea, this person is preaching a different gospel. He's saying Jesus actually isn't really God from God, true God from true God, light from light. Where we get some of the verbiage from the Nicene Creed is coming as an attack against Arianism. Well, fast forward to 1517, let's say, just to put a number out there, where Martin Luther starts preaching a different gospel, sola fide. It's only by faith. It's only by faith. Sola scriptura. You only need the scriptures, and such things like that. And it's like, well, is that actually the gospel? And we look back and we see how the gospel has actually been transferred from generation to generation. It's like, no, it's a little off. It's a little off in this way. It's not just faith alone. It's faith and works, as James says. It's, faith needs to be producing works. Works perfect faith and these sorts of things. Sola scriptura, well, the Bible doesn't even claim that, and it really is nonsensical. And so he's claiming to preach a gospel that is this sort of imputed righteousness, this that God, you're still just a muck of sin, but God just covers you up and kind of ignores the rest, versus like what the scriptures and the fathers have professed is that, no, God does want to make you holy. And he does it through the grace of Jesus Christ coming to us through the sacraments. We see the sacrament, let's say, of the Eucharist was always seen to be the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. Okay, Luther did hold on to a form of that, but he didn't hold on to the Catholic way of understanding that. Okay, so we can give Luther maybe some credit there. But then Calvin and Zwingli and these others all changed the view about the Eucharist. Maybe it's just a spiritual presence. Or Zwingli, maybe it doesn't mean anything. It's just to get us to think back about Jesus' sacrifice and doesn't actually do anything or mean anything. That is a change in the gospel of Jesus Christ. So, should we listen to those false prophets? No. We should listen to the Catholic Church, where the gospel has been preserved generation after generation. As far as moving the Sabbath, and I would like for you to read some of those things again. Well, I remember the first one you said, like changing the Sabbath. Okay, yes, the Jewish Sabbath was on Saturday, but now in the Christian Sabbath, it's moved to Sunday. Why? It's because Jesus rose again on Sunday. And the earliest documentation we have from Christians, I believe the Didache, First century document talks about it being moved to Sunday. St. Justin Martyr, for sure, in around 150 AD, says it's moved to Sunday because of the Lord raising from the dead on Sunday. So they're explaining how, yes, we're celebrating on Sunday. It's the Lord's Day. And even the Bible itself attests to the Lord's Day in the New Testament, I believe in the book of Revelation, referring to the Lord's Day as Sunday. And so we have all this. So basically, if the Catholic Church is wrong about, quote unquote, changing the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday, and that's a reason to be against the Catholic Church, then you'd have to throw out the testimony of the first century Christians, the second century Christians, and every Christian that's come after that. And so,
yeah, that was
are you willing to do
strange. That was definitely a strange one. I mean, the whole post is strange, but sometimes it's fun.
Yeah, and the Mary being exalted over Christ, absolutely not. The Catechism of the Catholic Church is very clear. We worship God and God alone. Mm-hmm. The adoration and worship that we give to the Father, to Jesus, to the Holy Spirit is altogether different than any sort of honor we give to a creature like Mary. Mary is definitely exalted, and everything that we say and honor about Mary is given so that we can protect and better honor and better worship Jesus. And so Mary, yes, is highly honored, highly exalted, but it's because by us exalting her as the mother of God, that testifies to Jesus being God.
Right.
Mary is an instrument of God's grace, testifies to the source of grace, Jesus Christ. And so Mary is not worshipped. She's not an idol. She is exalted as the mother of God because she is. And that is an exalted role for sure, but that doesn't mean we worship her. We worship God and God alone. Yeah. And then what were some of the other ones real quick?
Yeah, let me, sorry, I have it screenshotted on my phone. And let me be clear. Like, first off, I'm not straw manning because I'm reading the post directly, but right. I also don't want to make it seem like this is representative of most Protestants. It isn't.
No,
most of my Protestant friends that I have are would think all this stuff is equally ridiculous.
But I have come across people that have stated these things. And it's important to talk about because, I used to think certain ways like this. Like, I'm not
right. I mean, the Mary thing is definitely common, but what strikes me about that is just the utter lack of curiosity. Right, because all you need to do is open the Catholic Catechism to see that that's wrong.
Right,
that's not some big research project. Right, this is something that you could take.
But
maybe you don't. Yeah, maybe you don't like the sort of reverence that Catholics show to Mary, but to say that they exalt Mary above Christ is just patently ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
Okay, the other ones were putting men in the position of God and creating idols to worship.
Yeah, so I think I covered the idol thing. Like, we definitely don't do that. It does say don't make a graven image, but what does that mean? Because immediately after in Exodus, Jesus or God commands the Israelites to make carved images of angels and put them in the Holy of Holies. Okay, so I think what he really means there, and what has always been thought to mean, is that you should make no idol. So which means that you don't. So if you had a statue and you worshiped the actual piece of wood, the statue, and thought it was God, that would be a problem. But if you create a statue of a saint, let's say, and you are kneeling before the statue and asking the saint to pray for you, you're not thinking that this piece of wood has any animation about it. You think that this is an icon of a saint. And when we honor the icon, we honor the saint. And that the saint will hear our prayers. And once again, we're not worshiping the saints, we are honoring them, which is a big difference. And by virtue of the incarnation, God becoming man, dwelling among us, the image of the invisible God, Jesus Christ, we now can have images of the only begotten Son of God because he imaged himself. He did that. So he became in the flesh. So if you just happened to live back then, 2,000 years ago, and you had your iPhone, let's say, or a phone, and you could snap a picture of Jesus, you could do that, because he was walking among us. And that's not idolatrous to do that. To claim that God became man and dwelt among us would, to say that the statues of the Catholic Church are idolatrous would be equivalent to saying Jesus taking on human flesh is idolatrous, which is absurd. And then the other one was, that men are in the position of God. Well, no, first of all, God is in the position of God, but God can appoint men to be his representatives, which he has done through all of Scripture. He appointed Moses to represent him to the Israelites. Was that wrong of God to do that? No, he can do it. And it's a test for us. If we respect Moses, it shows our respect to God. Jesus appointed Peter as the rock which he would build his church on, gave him and him alone the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and appointed the other apostles to carry out his mission. And he said to them, whoever rejects you rejects me. So when we reject these men who represent God to us and who are supposed to carry on the mission of God, when we reject their authority, we're rejecting God himself. And so it's not that they take away from God's glory. In fact, it's quite the opposite. By them having and carrying the authority that Jesus himself gave to them, it exalts God's glory. Jesus alone is king, but he shares his reign to those who endure to the end. And so that magnifies his glory, the glory of God.
Yeah. Good stuff. Well, I'm satisfied with that.
Thanks.
Sure.
All right. I'll keep on the political one real quick, because this is an interesting question that I kind of have here. So in 2015, gay marriage was legalized in the United States of America. It seems that it's a done deal, right? Like the battle is kind of over, as far as like you don't hear many petitions of like we should reverse this or we should make it illegal.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I have like multiple thoughts about what I'm about to ask, but basically like fundamental question is, well, why should societies promote marriage between one man and one woman? And secondly, like, is it worth fighting for anymore in America, as far as like fighting for this to become illegal? Or what should we be fighting for now that we know that this is legalized, but we still value marriage as an institution from God? And like, how does that work? So
right. Yeah.
Some thoughts there.
Yeah. Good one. A searching one, one that has, I guess, many potential layers to explore. The first one, and we've covered this in previous episodes, so I won't repeat too much right here and now, is just the general topic of sexual ethics, right? This is a sexual act. Is it susceptible to a moral analysis, right? Is there something about the sexual act that can be done in a way that could contribute to our human flourishing? And is there something about the sexual act that could point us away, that could frustrate human flourishing? And I say yes, right? I didn't always think this way. I think this way now, right? And part of that comes with an essentialist worldview, right? That there is a such thing as human nature. Again, it puts moral constraints on us. There are certain things that we can do objectively to grow in excellence, in perfection, in flourishing, right? And there are certain things objectively that will tilt us away from or impede our human flourishing, that can cause us to fail to reach our proper and ultimate end, right? So that's sort of the underlying ethical basis. And as I've argued many times in writing on various podcasts, I don't think you can have a moral project without a commitment to essentialism and traditional natural law. And once you have that commitment, you're going to get a pretty traditional sexual morality out of that, right? And so I've written on this before, that there's kind of a dilemma there, right? If you want to affirm a binding moral structure to the world, that some things are really right, other things are really wrong, and that our moral intuitions are at least generally aiming towards something that is real in a sense. Maybe they're not infallible, but they're generally reliable. We're going to need to ground that in human nature, and we're going to need both essentialism and teleology. But that comes with a price, right? And that is that our lives are shot through with moral considerations. And it's not just linked to our sexual acts, but how we speak, how we treat other people, because, what we do, even on a very minor level, is kind of etching out who we are, right? So my argument, my general argument, is that if you want to hold on to morality, which I think all of us do, there are going to be metaphysical commitments that can allow you to do that. but they're going to be ethical implications from that most people would consider very traditional and very, very religious, very Christian, I would argue. And when that applies to the sexual act, it's that the sexual act has a proper functioning, it has a proper end, a proper aim towards both union and procreation, as the Catholic Church teaches, right? But I would argue you can just figure this out philosophically through a traditional natural law analysis. And that to ever intentionally pervert a faculty, to intentionally frustrate a sort of natural power from attaining its natural end, that itself is an analysis that would merit its own episode, but we'll just kind of float it out there for now. Is as a matter of metaphysical necessity, it's always going to be bad for you. It's always going to be wrong, right? So that would include, using your sexual powers, and it's not just in sort of the same sex liaisons or encounters as well, but there's other instances, even self acts that we would say would always be bad for you, as well. Certain overuse or addictions or obsessions, right? That would be bad for you as well. So the reason I'm trying to generalize this is not to get around the question, but to see that when it comes to the analysis of the same-sex act as sort of veering off course in terms of traditional natural law, it's not exclusive to that, right? That gets a lot of attention because it's culturally very relevant right now. But it's like one chapter in a very large book, right? And that's very important to understand, because a lot of times people say, well, Christians and Catholics and traditional natural law theorists, like, you're just obsessed with sex. No, we're not. The culture's obsessed with sex, right? And it just so happens that you guys are always bringing it up and always challenging it, so we're responding to it, right? But we could run this analysis on any other sorts of sinful acts. So I just want to get that out there. So yeah, the same-sex act is always going to be bad for you. It's always going to be bad for you because we're intentionally, impeding a natural power from reaching its natural end, and that we are teleologically ordered for the sexual act towards both union and procreation. And once we see that, we can see that the whole procreative element of that, and part of the reason it's bound up with the unitive element, is that we're not only ordered usually to have one kid, but many kids. And kids need rearing. They need development. And it takes a lot of time to do that. And after one kid usually comes another kid. So like in order to kind of fulfill that whole project, it takes a lot of time, right? So we can see how we're just from a pure kind of philosophical analysis, something like a traditional monogamous marriage starts to arise out of that. So just even putting aside divine revelation, which obviously affirms that, we can see how something like a very traditional marriage just comes out of a sort of philosophical anthropology and ethical considerations of human sexual activity, right? So once that's understood, that's like what marriage is, the first thing to note is that same-sex marriage is just a redefinition of a term, and same thing with like saying that two guys have sex. That's not right. Right? Like it's not. Sex, again, the proper ordering of sex is something that in its natural normal course, something a procreative and sort of comprehensive unity is at least possible. Right now, there might be some type of genetic or medical reason why procreation can't happen, but in its normal natural course, it's at least possible. That's never possible with two guys, right? It just isn't. So whatever two guys do, it's not sex. It's maybe mutual masturbation or whatever you want to call it. Not to get too graphic with the language, but I think precision is really important, because a lot of times, the wool is pulled over our eyes politically by redefinitions and manipulations of language. And once you realize that, that it makes no sense of like two guys to have sex, it also doesn't make sense to say that two guys could ever be married, right? And this is why I think it's important for us to understand that whatever else we want to call it, it's not a marriage as properly and traditionally understood. It's something else, right? So like same-sex marriage, we would argue, is just, it's a contradiction in terms. It's like a square circle. Like what you're talking about really doesn't even make sense. So there's just like a fundamental conceptual impossibility, that an absurdity that people have just gone along with. So like we're arguing it like way down on the practical level, but I would argue we have to bring it back up and say, like, what you're talking about isn't even a thing. First off, right? It's just not a thing. We've just manipulated language, right? And we see this all the time. I mean, we talk about like abortion being healthcare. It's a joke, right? It's a complete joke, right? Killing somebody can never be healthcare, right? Ever.
Right.
So, if you want to, try and see through the fog of politics, just always be very, ask for definitions, and always try to be cautious of when terms might be getting redefined, right? Because that is one of the most cliche and overused and very effective political strategies that is being used right now. We're seeing man and woman trying to be redefined with the whole gender ideology, which I would argue is just sort of an expected extension of the same-sex stuff that has come before it. Okay, so those are just some conceptual things. Practically, again, it comes from human nature, right? Human nature ordered towards the rearing of children. Children have a right to be reared by a mother and a father, right? They have rights claims on. And this is why in civilized societies, we punish deadbeat dads who get women pregnant and then try, and we should punish that, right? We should provide strong disincentives for fathers that want to engage in the sexual act without a proper understanding of what the moral implications are of that, which is unitive and procreative. Right. And everybody agrees with that. Everybody agrees that if dad tries to abandon the scene, we should punish dad. And I'm fully on board with that. Right. Because children have a right claim on their father for the father's love, attention, care, education, moral development. So anything less than that, I would argue, is an abuse to children. It is child abuse. And this is true not just in terms of the traditional natural law perspective of what children are owed. A lot of people think about the adults, but we forget about what children are owed.
Yep.
Children are owed this. They're owed a mom and dad, right? A mom and dad, a biological mom and dad who stay together through a comprehensive lifelong union, right? That's what children are owed. And that's why divorce is a form of child abuse, I would argue. I'm a product of divorce. I can tell you it's very traumatic. And not just considering it from the ethical perspective, but the empirical perspective. We know the damage that has been done to children through broken families. I mean, we know that nothing better prepares you for a healthier, more successful life than having mom and dad together, right? And a strong family, traditional family household. So we not only have the philosophical analysis, we have the empirical support. We know what happens with broken homes. It's terrible for the children. It's terrible for long-term outcomes. This couldn't be more obvious from many, many different perspectives. So we have now, I guess, is getting to your second point. So what does that mean? It means we should incentivize traditional family units, right? Because if we want healthy societies, we need healthy new generations to lead those societies,
Yes.
right? We need healthy formation. So society at large is dependent on that first society, which is the family unit, right? So we have every reason for society at large, our nation or country, to provide the strongest incentives it can for healthy traditional family units, right? Because we need healthy traditional family units for a healthy country overall. And we can't expect a healthy country overall unless we have healthy. So it's symbiotic relationship is what I would argue. So that means we should have strong incentives for families to stay together and to have lots of children, I would argue. And we see countries that do this. Strong incentives for having children. We should have strong disincentives for divorce. We should get rid of ridiculous laws like no-fault divorce and stuff like that. And yeah, we should recognize that not only just, I think, push back against the legality of same-sex marriage, but just also its conceptual absurdity. Like, go even deeper. Like, this isn't even a thing. Now, if we want to discuss privileges for civil unions in general, of like a brother and a sister taking care of an older parent, that's a separate that's a separate debate, or just people living together for certain legal privileges, and that's kind of context dependent on what those legal privileges would be in the society as a whole. But regardless of all of that, I think every society needs to take a vested interest for itself and for society at large as creating special privileges and special incentives for the traditional family unit. And of course, none of this can be isolated. Like, we have to consider all the wider factors: how kids are educated, their moral upbringing in the education system, how sexual ethics is taught or not taught, in public education. So there's so much interconnectedness here that it's hard to kind of just pinpoint one thing. But at least this much. And then in terms of it being a done deal, it's not a done deal. We've seen many other countries that have pushed back against many of these progressive secular agendas and done very well with that. Unfortunately, it's often after a time that they've gone through immense pain that far left-wing ideology brings, and they kind of have to learn the hard way. But it's this idea of the Overton window, and I think this is a difference between conservatives and progressives in our country. Is that conservatives are always willing to push the Overton window. They're, of what's allowed in acceptable conversation, right? So they'll always go out on a limb and say something that everyone thinks is crazy, like women can have a biological penis or something ridiculous like that, and the right, which you hear now. And like the first time people hear it, they're like, that's crazy. We don't have to worry about that because it's so crazy. But then they keep doing it, and they keep doing it, and they keep doing it. And the Overton window eventually shifts, right? And we saw it with same-sex, marriage. And now we're seeing it with LGBTQ ideology. And conservatives just assume that because something is so crazy, it will never gain traction. That's historically completely wrong, right? These things do gain traction. And the problem is progressives are willing to always push the Overton window. Conservatives are not only not willing to push back, but they're certainly seem unwilling to let me rephrase that. They're not only seem unwilling to prevent the Overton window from shifting, but they seem especially unwilling to want to push it back in what I would argue is the proper direction. And that's, to your point, is like a lot of, quote unquote conservatives, mainstream Republicans, like they don't even talk about traditional marriage.
Right.
They just think it's a done deal. And that's why I think these people are losers. You're not a conservative. You're just not. Like, whatever you are, like, you don't have a proper moral and ethical formation, because if you did, you'd realize, no, these are fundamental issues and we need to push the conversation back in the other direction. And a lot of it is just because they're cowards. One is they don't know why they hold the positions they do, so they're just ignorant. And the other is they just give in to the bully tactics and intimidation tactics of people who would just call them bigots or whatever, because they oppose these types of social policies. There's nothing bigoted about it. It just is what it is. So my answer is yes. We should be fighting these cultural battles because it's everything. And I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic because I think what we're seeing now with all the political upheaval is, I guess I could go either way. I mean, a lot of people with the LGBTQ stuff, it's a shame that it took it getting into sports until people got really upset, if you know what I mean. Right? With like men dominating women in sports. Like that to me is like fairness in sports is the least of my concern. Like, okay, that's a little annoying, but how about we stop pretending that men can be women in the first place, right? Like why did it take until it got into somebody beating up your daughter in a wrestling match who's a dude? Why, like maybe that's just like the most obvious manifestation in your life of this absurdity, but like we should have a problem not there, but at the first instance when somebody is so confused that they think a man could ever be a woman.
Right.
That's the fundamental issue. So it's not about fairness in sports. It's about truth.
Right.
It's about truth. So like I'm seeing like more conservatives make arguments of like we shouldn't allow transgenders in sports, and like fine, at least they're fighting some battles. But to me, it just seems like you're already so far down the field at this point. Like we should have been fighting the battle way back at the opposite end. So I don't even know if I answered your questions, Eric, but
No,
I've been
you
going for long
did.
enough. Yeah.
And it reminds me of what we talked about in our Gospel of John series of, the light came, but men loved darkness instead. And they
Right.
rejected the truth. And one minor follow-up question. I'm just curious because maybe this is a question on other people's minds. But, okay, so let's say you have two lesbian women that are quote-unquote married legally in the United States, and you have a child that's in a really terrible orphanage, and no one's adopting this child. They can either stay at this terrible orphanage, or this same-sex couple, they really had wanted a daughter, and they want to adopt.
Right.
Should the government say, no, you can't because you're a same-sex couple, or yes, you can? And I'm sorry, it's just like
Yeah,
a
no, I
follow-up
understand.
question.
No, I
That's like,
understand your question. Yeah, so let me put it this way, right? Like you have a child that's already in a terrible situation, right?
right,
And you have this sort of same-sex couple that wants to adopt it, and they seem like they'll take much better care of the child, right? That's essentially it. So wouldn't it be better? And in a sense, I want to say yes. So I want to say a couple things to this. Number one is we don't use exceptions to form rules, right? We don't base policy on exception cases, right? And Catholics and natural law theorists, we have the equipment for our moral reasoning to handle things like this, called the doctrine of double effect. Like, okay, we can take this option because given the situations, we're trying to prevent the greater evil, even if there's foreseen negative consequences, but we're not intending those foreseen negative consequences, right?
right,
So we can handle situations like this, but we don't base the rules off of these exceptions, right? And same thing is when it comes to like the like it, it's difficult to have these because it's hard to like give the examples without getting kind of crude, if you know what I mean. But
right.
I guess we'll just do it, right? So like let's say that there's a child in the woods, Eric, and
Mm.
we're there, and there's no mother around. But wouldn't it be better if like we took care of the children ourselves, like two guys just took care of this children? And the answer is yes. But then the question is like, why would sodomy have to be brought into that?
Right,
Right.
right.
So you see what I'm getting at,
Yeah,
right? And bringing up a child, um, of two women wanting to virtuously take care of a child in and of itself doesn't seem like a bad thing, especially if there's no other option, right? And if the child is being previously abused. But why do perverted sexual acts have to be brought into it,
yeah,
right? That's what people are overlooking, right? Because then you are instilling something into the child that is itself abusive, that's tilting the child away. Now, you might just have abusive situation A and abusive situation B, and doctrine of double effect kicks in, and you just say, I'm going to go with the situation, not because I want the abuse that's attached with it, but I'm trying to prevent the greater evil. And that would be a morally acceptable choice, because you would be delighted if the abusive situation in situation A wasn't there. Like you'd be like,
yes,
you're not aiming for that, right?
right,
It'd be better if it wasn't there, but just given the constraints of the circumstances, you can still make a morally permissible choice.
mm-hmm.
So we can handle these kind of thought experiments, but the point is, why would perverse sexual activity need to be brought into that? What would that add? I would say it wouldn't add anything. It would be detrimental to the child, first off.
Mm-hmm.
And two is we just don't use exceptions to form general policies or rules.
Right.
So we can handle exceptions as they come up, but we don't base policies off of exceptions.
All right, very good.
Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Tough. I mean, a tough one. People don't like talking about this stuff, but I mean, it's the conversations that you need to have.
Yeah.
And especially trying to do it without getting into the gory details.
Exactly.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Maybe one more question each, or
yeah, let's do it. So let me think back on if you actually, do you have one more off the top of your head? Yeah,
I have two questions.
All right, yeah, throw one more out there because I gotta think more. Sorry, I didn't prepare before.
No.
But,
okay, so the second question, the third question has to do with philosophy. But I'm not going to do that because the other question I had also has to do with politics. And since you're already on the roll, might as well just
throw me under the
going.
Just throw me under
what is socialism and why is it bad? parentheses, why I'm asking this question is because it seems like a lot of people are concerned that America is becoming socialist,
Right.
and that socialism seems to be spreading from now China to the ends of the earth. And people are very concerned, and some people are like, yay, and other people are like, nay. And so just want to just to ask
Okay.
you.
So this is a big one, right? And again, definitions, redefinitions, right? So sometimes what's called socialism isn't socialism, right? So let's get clear here, is that like having social programs, having welfare states, that's not socialism properly understood. And that's like what a lot of, American mainstream Republicans need to understand. As a common good conservative, as a Catholic, we can be, and I would argue often should be, in favor of various and any number of social programs and social welfare, right? Socialism, as it comes out of Marxism, is grounded in a number of philosophical commitments that are fundamentally absurd and opposed to human flourishing and human nature, which is why the Catholic Church was able to condemn socialism before socialism wrought immense havoc on the planet, right? So we have pronouncements from the Catholic Church, various popes condemning socialism before it racked up its enormous body count. Now, why is that? Because on a moral analysis, it's a failure. And for a couple of reasons. One is that, there's certain commitments of Karl Marx and his philosophy that kind of undergird his socialism. So it might be worth just kind of
Yeah.
exploring a number of these, right? So first off, socialism and communism are it's important for people to understand that they're really just they're on the same. It's really a matter of achievement is the difference,
Two
right?
sides of the same coin,
Not
sort of.
even necessarily that. They're just
Different stages of development.
different stages of development is exactly that, right? So the idea for Marx is he was fundamentally an anarchist, right? So the idea is that we would eventually get to some egalitarian society where we could abolish the state, right? Where we wouldn't even need the state at any point. But socialism was kind of how we got there. And so traditionally understood, socialism is really just the abolition of private property. That's what we're talking about when it comes to socialism. I hesitate to simplify it too much, but the idea is government ownership of the means of production, private property, right? And trying to get us to a society based on certain egalitarian commitments, where eventually the state would just dissolve, right? Where we wouldn't have any of these sort of different class structures, right? So for traditionally Marx, he wants to kind of reduce everything to economics. So let's go through his various commitments. One thing is he's a dialectic materialist, right? As his metaphysical commitments, which is like essentially taking the worst of Hegel and the worst of Feuerbach and mixing them together. So he's an atheist. Strike number one, right? So no transcendent anything, right? And he's a materialist. Strike number two. And he's a dialectic materialist. So he kind of thinks that in a very odd, incoherent, and inexplicable way, the material universe is sort of just kind of like working itself out in this progressive development. So he kind of takes like this commitment that was previously seen in idealism and kind of like puts it into materialism. And all I can say is it's not just utterly incoherent and very strange, but even most Marxists don't commit themselves to this metaphysical premise anymore, because it's just so untenable. But it's important to understand the history of it, because metaphysics, and especially bad metaphysics, has consequences, right? So we're kind of living with these consequences. Marx is also an economic reductionist and determinist, right? So he thinks that everything can kind of be explained by economic class struggles. Like everything can be explained by economic class struggles, religion, various cultures, societies, you name it. And that itself is ridiculous, right? I mean, it's obvious. It's certain aspects of history and human society have arose from considerations independent of just economic class struggles. I mean, some of the most major historical instances have arisen independent. I mean, of course, religion, Christianity, Judaism themselves, right, certainly do not reduce to economic class struggles, no matter how much the revisionist historian tries to say otherwise, right? So you have dialectic materialism, economic reductionism, uh, and of course, a fundamental denial of human nature and traditional natural law, the sort of the moral dimension of the human person, which leads to a sort of grotesque utilitarianism within socialism, right?
Hmm.
That we're kind of looking at the collective, and then based on what our goals for the collective are, we have a sort of ends justify the means mentality that happens with socialism, right? So we can use government force to organize society however we want. Uh, and this has been done in an exceedingly number of vicious, inhumane, and diabolical and genocidal ways throughout the history of socialism. The body count is unfathomable, which is always strikes me, and it's like still going on now. It's like you see people
Yeah.
eating flamingos in Venezuela because they have nothing else to eat, and people still advocate for socialism. Like, how high does the body count need to get on a practical level, let alone the absurd philosophy that socialism extends from? So socialism is wrong because it's got it, where it comes from. Its foundation is wrong metaphysically. It's got its philosophical anthropology wrong. It's got its history wrong. And it's got its morality wrong. So it strikes out on every single level.
Wow.
And if that is enough, it's been tested. It's been tested, right? So it
That what
fails
blows
on
my
every.
mind, Pat, is
Mhm.
that it has been tested and like it failed in Russia or Soviet Union. It's failed in everywhere it's been. And so why do people still push it and promote it? And like, why is it still spreading if it's already failed?
Yeah, I mean that is a great question, and probably not one that I'm as qualified to answer. But I mean, there's certain aspects of it that superficially are pretty easy to sell. It appeals to kind of the baser aspects of human nature, right? It appeals to tribalistic impulses, certainly, of wanting to, and you see it now, right? So a whole bunch of this sort of the whole what we have now with the sort of race warfare that's going on in America is the same thing. It's the same Marxist ideology. It's the same pig with a different lipstick, right? The reason you're oppressed, the reason your life is the way it is because of white people, right? Not necessarily rich people or a certain economic class now, but now it's a racial thing, right? Um, and this is how it takes hold and grips people's brains. And the scary thing is people don't recognize that this is what's happening. It's the
Mm,
same ideology, just a different context, right? The reason your life isn't everything you want it to be, or the reason that it's bad and the reason it's terrible, is because of this, because of people of a certain skin color or people of a certain economic position. And the sad thing is, when it comes to constructing these narratives, is you can find enough um instances that make it seem plausible. It's like you can find enough rich people have done terrible oppressive things. You can find enough white people that have done terrible oppressive things, right, to paint a story, even though it's completely ridiculous, hateful, false, immoral, and ravages people's rationality. um but I mean, that's what's going on, right? So the ideology, critical theory, what people need to understand, is really an extension of Marxist theory, and critical
mm,
theory is what's kind of behind so much of this sort of intersectionality, race warfare that's going on. So the deeper psychology of it is something that we could spend a lot of time talking about, discussing. But it's not. I don't think it's. I don't think it's not that hard to imagine why people buy into this.
yeah.
We can see how it has how it would have appealed to certain people, how it could alleviate people of things that they don't necessarily want to do or own up to. Like, nobody wants to think that um, maybe the reason I'm not in a great spot is because of some of the decisions I've made. Nobody likes to think about that. Now, look,
Wow.
granted, some people are in bad positions through no fault of their own. Certainly, right? And that's why Christians are called to a life of justice and charity. Some people just have it bad because of where they were born, because of the failure of their parents or society at large, because of persecution. Nobody's denying that. But other people have just made it's other people, it's a mix. Some upbringing, some bad choices. Other people had great upbringing and they made really bad choices, right? The point is, and when we search our hearts, we all know this, it's never easy. It's always easier and always more tempting that whatever befalls us to want to find somebody to point the finger at, right? And we could see how any ideology that could help a person rationalize away the things they want to rationalize away, why that might be appealing, as pernicious as it is. So those are just some initial thoughts.
Wow.
But Marxism is first, it's a deep philosophy. It goes, to really understand socialism, you got to try and understand Marxism. To understand Marxism, you got to try and understand where he's drawing his philosophy from, and everything that's wrong with it. But I would say when you analyze it metaphysically, morally, historically, economically, in terms of philosophical anthropology, it gets everything fundamentally wrong. When you look at what it's done, that alone should be enough for you to want to reject it. And then the key is to try and see when the ideology is creeping up and how it's creeping up again, because it never, like, people think we won the Cold War and that was it. No, this has been festering in academia for a long time.
Wow.
And it's now really taking hold of our population in I think a pretty frightening way. So
the language
see,
wars, I mean,
the manipulation of language, the revision of history, all of it, right? The tribalistic intersectionality, class-based, racial, manufactured warfare, all of it. Yeah, all of that. Mm-hmm.
It's so crazy. I think one connecting piece for me, at least after this discussion, and you don't need to ask me another question. I think that was good for today. But no, seriously,
I'll prepare more in advance.
This was awesome. I think a connecting piece for me is just so for example, with this issue of socialism, church condemns it right when it creeps up in the mid 1800s, right? In the late 1800s, especially, like Pope Leo XIII condemned socialism. And then, but that was before we really saw the ravenous effects and that had been tested, but we already knew that it didn't make sense, that it actually was opposing God's will. And if people had just listened to the church, it would have just prevented millions and millions of people of dying in the 20th century. But people don't listen to the church. Okay, fast forward in time. People predicted, I remember this, I think you may remember this too, before 2015, when there was still a debate about gay marriage, conservatives and Catholics and all these people came out and said, hey, if you let this happen, here's what's going to happen. Basically, like, once you let the Pandora's box out, you've just redefined marriage to the point where marriage loses its meaning and anything is fair game. And every opponent was like, no, that's ridiculous. This is just what we want.
Slippery slope fallacy.
No slippery slope here. But what happened? Boom. Like, right when that was legalized, we see now the transgender movement take off, like, immediately after that. And we see just this gradual devolving as a society that has expedited exponentially.
Right.
It's just like quickened the pace of our moral depravity as a nation since 2015. And that's only 5 years we're talking about. Like, that's crazy. But had people actually listened to the church, listened to the voices that were saying, listen, we see the philosophy and the theology and the all the presuppositions behind what's happening, and this is where it ends, and people had ignored it.
Right.
So maybe it's time for people to listen to the church.
It's funny. I have a recent conversation with somebody, a friend of mine who's agnostic, and he's very libertarian leading. I would say he's probably mostly liberal in his commitments, but he admitted this to me. He said, when all the sexual stuff was originally, really being debated, I always thought conservatives were just conspiracy theorists, and they would say it would lead to all this insane stuff, and even promotions of pedophilia. And he's like, Now I'm on their side, right? Because
because he's seen it.
he's seen it, and he's like, I wish that I wouldn't have fought against them because. So this is some guy. He's not religious. He's never been a conservative, and has had his mind actively changed because he's seen exactly what you've described.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And there's always hope for things to reverse, for things to change, but it takes conversion of heart, it takes prayer, penance, it takes like us, changing into saints ultimately, and having an influence on society. And I think the hope really, the more I think about things, it's, the domestic church, the family, building up the family. That doesn't mean, and every generation, we all have to face persecution. Like if you seek to live a godly life, you will face persecution. So that seems to be inevitable. Like to be Christian, you will be persecuted. I think we just have to band together during this, whatever's coming next, and say, hey, we're going to live in the truth, whatever it takes. And we're going to try to push that Overton window or whatever you called it in the right direction, slowly but surely. It may
Be
take a lot of
bold.
time.
Yes, be bold. And
Yes.
like that's the thing is like, obviously I think people on the left, progressive left, are very zany and they believe in sane and often immoral things, but I got to give it to them. Like they're at least
Bold.
bold,
Yeah.
right? And as Christians, that's what we're called to be bold, right? So
Yeah.
there is something to be learned there. Is that if you're willing to be bold and you're willing to get out there, you can move the conversation. You can, and we need to do that. Mm-hmm.
I remind of the verse in 2 Timothy, for God has not given you a spirit of fear or timidity. For God has not given you a spirit of timidity to fall back into fear, but has given you a spirit of power and of love and of self-control. And so I think that's a great way to end. Like, let's just reflect on that. And, by virtue of our confirmation as Catholics, we've been given the gift of fortitude. And so we have every reason to be bold. You shouldn't be afraid of suffering because you can offer that up in union with Christ for the salvation of the world. You shouldn't be afraid of death because we have the hope of the resurrection. And if you don't fear suffering or death, you have nothing to fear. And perfect love casts out fear anyway. So there's no reason not to be bold and step up to the plate and like fight. And please, everyone, keep me accountable to being bold as well. Like, because there are a lot of pressures and nobody likes to be seen as a bigot or someone like that. But at the end of the day, like, to live a godly life, you will be persecuted, and you just got to count the cost and still follow
Yeah, and
Jesus.
one thing about the bigot thing is that the reason, the fundamental reason that I take the positions I do is because I think that that's what it means to live a good life, and I want everybody to flourish, right? And to love somebody is to will the good of the other. So in any sense, if I have a family member, as I have, who's struggling with drug or alcohol addiction, and I say I don't think you should be doing that. I really don't think it's not bigoted, right?
Right.
It's like I think that's really bad for you, and
It's actually loving.
It's because I care about you that I want you to stop that. So like maybe you think that we're wrong. I certainly don't think we are. But you don't, yeah. And anybody who's going to promote this, don't worry about being called names. You'll be called names no matter what. Just you know, present it in with as much clarity and generosity as possible, and then pray, and then pray, let God do the
Yes.
rest. Right? That's all we can do. Mm-hmm.
Pray, hope, and don't worry, as Padre Pio said. All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Have a great, great day.